In the vast expanse of the Orion Arm, where civilizations rose and fell like tides against cosmic shores, there existed a silence. Not the absence of sound, for space itself had always been silent, but the absence of something far more profound, the absence of humanity. For 3 centuries, the galactic concordat had known peace. 47 species, from the crystalline Zaithakari to the gaseous Niflun, had formed an alliance that spanned 12,000 star systems. Trade flowed like rivers between worlds. Knowledge was shared freely. Wars had become obsolete. And in all this harmony, in all this carefully orchestrated civilization, there was one thing that the concordat never spoke of. One shadow that lurked at the edge of every diplomatic gathering, every treaty signing, every celebration of their collective achievement. They never spoke of Earth. Admiral Krixtel of the Vorthak Navy stood before the massive viewport of the dreadnought Eternal Consensus, her 6 eyes reflecting the swirling hyperspace tunnel that carried her fleet toward the outer rim. Her chitinous exoskeleton, a deep purple that spoke of noble birth among her kind, gleamed under the ship's bioluminescent lighting. But there was no nobility in what she felt now. There was only dread. "Admiral," came the melodious voice of her aide, Subcommander Nethric. "The Council's final transmission has arrived." Krixtel's mandibles clicked, a sound that in the old tongue of her species meant acknowledgement tainted with reluctance. "Display it." The hologram materialized before her, 53 beings representing every major species in the Concordat. At their center sat Chancellor Quindar of the Althan Republic, his luminescent skin pulsing with the measured rhythms that indicated careful deliberation. "Admiral Krixtel," the Chancellor began, his translated words carrying the weight of unanimous decision. "The time for silence has ended. After 3 centuries of peace, the humans have returned to our borders. Our sensors have detected 17 vessels of unknown configuration approaching the Kepler expanse. They are not responding to any hails. They are not broadcasting any identification. They are simply coming." A pause. In that pause, Krixtel heard the echo of something that had haunted the Concordat for 300 years. "You are hereby authorized to use any means necessary to protect Concordat space. The humans were exiled for a reason, Admiral. That reason has not changed. They must not be allowed to return." The transmission ended, leaving Krixtel alone with her thoughts and the gentle hum of her ship's bio-neural networks. She turned away from the viewport, her claws clicking against the organic deck plating as she made her way to the bridge. The exile. Everyone knew the stories, but few knew the truth. 3 centuries ago, humanity had been one of the founding members of what would become the Galactic Concordat. They had brought with them technologies that seemed impossible, faster-than-light communication that didn't rely on quantum entanglement, energy shields that could withstand stellar radiation, weapons that could crack moons. But it wasn't their technology that had made them dangerous. "Admiral on the bridge," announced the ship's consciousness, its voice a harmony of biological and artificial intelligence that the Vorthak had perfected over millennia. Krixtel's crew, 37 beings representing 12 different species, turned toward her with a mixture of respect and barely concealed fear. They knew where they were going. They knew what they might face. "Status report," she commanded, settling into her command chair, which molded itself to accommodate her insectoid physiology. "Hyperspace exit in 47 minutes, reported Navigator Yulcine, her translucent form shimmering as data flowed through her gaseous anatomy. "Long-range sensors are detecting the human fleet exactly where the Council predicted. 17 vessels, unknown configuration. They appear to be waiting." "Waiting for what?" "Unknown, Admiral. They've established a standard defensive formation at the edge of the Kepler expanse, approximately 12 light minutes from the nearest Concordat outpost. They're not advancing, but they're not retreating either." Krixtel's compound eyes studied the tactical display that materialized before her. 17 ships, against her fleet of 43 of the most advanced vessels in Concordat space. On paper it should be no contest, but paper had never accounted for humanity. She remembered the stories her grandmother had told her. Stories that were officially classified but which every military family in the Concordat knew by heart. Stories of human ships that wouldn't die even when their hulls were breached and their crews were dead. Stories of human soldiers who fought with an intensity that bordered on madness, who would sacrifice themselves without hesitation to protect their comrades. Stories of a species that, when cornered, became something else entirely, something terrifying. Admiral, came a voice from the communications station. We're receiving a transmission. Crixtel felt her heart skip a beat. Both of them. From the human? Yes, Admiral. Audio only. It's in perfect galactic standard. Put it through. The bridge fell silent except for the gentle bioluminescent pulse of the ship's living systems. Then through the speakers came a voice that Crixtel had hoped never to hear again. A human voice. Greetings, Admiral Crixtel of the Eternal Consensus. This is Captain James Morrison of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. I know you probably weren't expecting to hear a human voice speaking your language today. Hell, I know you probably weren't expecting to hear a human voice at all. The voice was calm, measured, carrying an accent that linguistic analysis would later identify as originating from the North American continent of Earth. But beneath that calm, Crixtel could hear something else. Something that made her exoskeleton itch with ancestral warnings. I'm going to guess that right about now you're wondering how we learned to speak Galactic Standard. Or how we knew you were coming. Or how we knew to wait for you here, specifically in the one system that your tactical doctrine says you'd use as a staging ground for a defensive action. Crixtel's mandibles clicked involuntarily. The human was right. The Kepler expanse was exactly where Concordat doctrine dictated they establish their defensive perimeter. How could the humans possibly know that? See, Admiral, that's the thing about exile. It gives you time to think, time to plan, time to learn. Morrison's voice took on a quality that Crixtel's translator couldn't quite capture. Something that her species had no word for, but which every prey animal in the galaxy would recognize instinctively. Predatory amusement. We've been watching you, Admiral. All of you. For 300 years we've been listening to your communications, studying your technology, learning your languages. Did you really think that exiling us to the outer darkness would make us disappear? Did you really think we'd just fade away? The transmission paused, and in that pause, Crixtel realized something that chilled her to her core. The human fleet wasn't defensive. It was positioned exactly where it needed to be to cut off her fleet's retreat route. They weren't waiting to be attacked. They were waiting to spring a trap. You exiled us because you said we were too violent, too unpredictable, too dangerous to exist alongside civilized species. Morrison's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. Well, Admiral, you were right. We are dangerous. 3 centuries of exile in the dark between the stars has made us so much more dangerous than you could possibly imagine. And now we're home. The transmission cut out, leaving the bridge of the Eternal Consensus in absolute silence. For a moment no one moved. No one spoke. They simply stared at the tactical display where 17 human ships held position like sleeping predators. Then Crixtel found her voice. Red alert. All hands to battle stations. Signal the fleet. Prepare for engagement. But even as the orders flowed from her mandibles, even as her crew leaped into action with the efficiency of trained professionals, Crixtel couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a terrible mistake. 3 centuries ago, humanity had been exiled for being too dangerous to coexist with the other species of the galaxy. They had been sent into the darkness beyond the outer rim, with nothing but their ships and their weapons and their unbreakable will to survive. What had they become in that darkness? What had 300 years of exile done to a species that was already considered too violent for civilized space? As her fleet dropped out of hyperspace and formed battle lines, as weapon systems charged and shields polarized, as 43 of the most advanced warships in the galaxy prepared to face 17 vessels of unknown design, Admiral Crixtel of the Vorthak Navy found herself asking a question that would haunt her for the rest of her very short life. Had the Concordat created its own doom by exiling the one species that might have been strong enough to protect it? The answer would come soon enough. In the cold vacuum between the stars, 17 human ships sat motionless, their hulls scarred by 3 centuries of wandering in the cosmic deep. They made no threatening moves. They sent no additional transmissions. They simply waited. But aboard the lead vessel, a ship whose name translated roughly to inevitable, Captain James Morrison stood before his own tactical display and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had spent 300 years planning for this moment, who had dedicated his entire civilization to a single consuming purpose: revenge. "All ships report ready, Captain," his tactical officer reported. Commander Lisa Park had been born in the dark between stars, as had her parents and their parents before them. She had never seen Earth, would never see Earth, but she carried its memory in her genes and its fury in her heart. Weapons systems, charged and ready. The new quantum disruptors are operating at peak efficiency. Temporal shields, active and stable. Time differential is holding at .7 standard. Morrison nodded, his eyes never leaving the display. The Concordat fleet was impressive. 43 vessels representing the pinnacle of galactic military technology. Under normal circumstances, it would be more than enough to destroy his small force. But these were not normal circumstances. "Open a channel to the fleet," he commanded. "Channel open, sir." Morrison straightened, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of exile pressing down on his shoulders. When he spoke, his words would be heard by every human ship in the system, by every man and woman who had been born in the darkness and raised on stories of a home they would never see. "Today, we return to the galaxy that cast us out, not as supplicants, not as refugees, but as conquerors. They wanted us gone because they feared what we might become. Today, they learned that their fears were justified." He paused, watching as the Concordat fleet finished its deployment. Beautiful ships, he had to admit. Elegant, sophisticated. Built by species that had known peace for so long they had forgotten what war truly meant. Remember what they took from us. Remember the children who died in the cold between stars because they refused us sanctuary. Remember the colonies that failed because they denied us resources. Remember that we are the orphans of Earth, and today we reclaim our birthright. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Show them what 3 centuries of exile has taught us. Show them what humanity becomes when it has nothing left to lose." The channel closed. Around him, his bridge crew worked with silent efficiency, their movements precise and economical. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary chatter. They were the children of exiles, raised in ships that traveled between dead stars, forged by hardship into something harder than steel. They were what humanity had become. "Admiral Crixidle is hailing us," his communications officer reported. On screen, the hologram that materialized showed a being that Morrison's genetic memory recognized as Vorthak, an insectoid species known for their strategic brilliance and unwavering loyalty to the Concordat. Her compound eyes were beautiful in their alien way, but Morrison could see the fear hiding behind their multifaceted surfaces. "Captain Morrison," she began, her translated voice carrying formal diplomatic protocols that Morrison found almost quaint. "I am Admiral Crixidle of the Galactic Concordat Navy. By order of the Concordat Council, you and your fleet are commanded to withdraw from Concordat space immediately. You are in violation of the Exile Accords of..." Morrison smiled again, that same cold, predatory expression. "Admiral, do you know what we've been doing for the past 300 years? I.e., that is not relevant. We've been dying." His voice cut through her words like a blade through silk. Slowly, generation by generation. "Do you know what it's like to raise children in ships that never touch solid ground? Do you know what it's like to watch them grow up knowing they'll never breathe natural air, never feel rain on their faces, never see a sunrise that isn't projected on a screen?" Admiral Crixide's mandibles clicked nervously. The exile was a necessity. Humanity proved too dangerous. "Dangerous?" Morrison's laugh was like the sound of breaking bones. "Admiral, you have no idea what dangerous means. But you're about to learn." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into the holographic representation of the alien officer. 300 years ago, you exiled us because we wouldn't follow your rules, because we wouldn't accept your limitations. Because when pushed, we pushed back harder than you thought possible. You called us violent, unpredictable, a threat to galactic peace." His smile vanished, replaced by an expression of such cold fury that Admiral Crixidle actually stepped back from her own holographic projector. "You were right." The transmission ended. For a moment the space between the two fleets remained silent. 43 Concordat vessels faced 17 human ships across a gulf of vacuum, and 3 centuries of bitter hatred. Stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the drama about to unfold in their light. Then Admiral Kriegstill gave the order that would echo through galactic history. All ships, open fire. The void erupted in violence. But as the first energy beams lanced out from the Concordat fleet, as torpedoes streaked through space trailing fire, as the greatest naval engagement in 3 centuries began with thunderous fury, something impossible happened. Time slowed. Around the human fleet, space itself seemed to ripple and bend. The incoming weapons fire moved like objects through thick liquid, their energy bleeding away into dimensional folds that human science had learned to create in the cold between stars. And in that bubble of twisted time, 17 human ships began to move. They moved like nothing Admiral Kriegstill had ever seen. Not with the graceful efficiency of Concordat vessels, but with something else entirely. Something primal. Something that spoke to the deepest, most primitive parts of her consciousness and whispered a single word. Predator. The first Concordat ship died before Admiral Kriegstill could even process what she was seeing. A human vessel, sleek and dark and somehow wrong in a way that her eyes couldn't quite quantify, simply materialized next to the heavy cruiser Harmony of Thought. There was no flash of weapons fire, no energy discharge that her sensors could detect. The Harmony of Thought simply ceased. One moment it was there, 800 meters of advanced Alphan engineering housing a crew of 300 souls. The next moment there was only empty space and a cloud of molecular debris that her sensors couldn't identify. "What?" she began. But her words were cut off as 2 more ships died in the same impossible way. "Admiral," her tactical officer screamed. "I'm reading massive energy discharges, but I can't identify the source. The human ships are moving through some kind of spatial distortion. Our targeting systems can't lock on." Kriegstill watched in growing horror as her fleet, 43 of the most advanced warships in the galaxy, was systematically destroyed by an enemy that her technology couldn't even properly perceive. The human ships moved through space like sharks through water, appearing next to their targets, delivering death with surgical precision, then vanishing back into their temporal shields before return fire could find them. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. "Signal the fleet," she ordered, her voice cracking with strain. "Emergency jump. All ships retreat." But it was too late. The last thing Admiral Kriegstill saw was the sleek hull of a human vessel materializing directly above her flagship. The last thing she heard was the sound of her ship's consciousness screaming as something tore through its bio-neural networks like acid through flesh. The last thing she thought, as her world dissolved into chaos and pain, was a question that would never be answered. What had 3 centuries of exile turned humanity into? In the space where the Concordat fleet had once held position, 17 human ships hung motionless among clouds of debris. No traces remained of the 43 vessels that had come to stop them. No escape pods. No survivors, no evidence that they had ever existed at all. Captain Morrison stood on his bridge, watching the readouts confirm what he already knew. Total victory. 0 casualties. Just as they had planned. Just as they had practiced on 1,000 dead worlds in the dark between stars. "Signal the fleet," he commanded. "Phase 1 is complete. Begin acceleration toward the core worlds." As his ship turned toward the heart of Concordat space, toward the civilized worlds that had cast humanity into exile, Morrison allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The Concordat had feared what humanity might become if left alone in the darkness. They had been wise to fear, but they had not been wise enough to ensure humanity could never return. Now their greatest nightmare was coming home, and it was hungry. The emergency session of the Galactic Concordat Council convened in chaos. 53 beings representing every major species in known space materialized as holograms around the vast amphitheater on Korthak Prime, their various forms of panic creating a cacophony that the universal translators struggled to parse. The crystalline Zythakari chimed in harmonic distress frequencies. The gaseous Nephilim pulsed with colors that indicated existential terror. Even the usually stoic Althan delegates rippled with patterns of fear. Chancellor Quindar called for order, his luminescent skin cycling through the deep, authoritative purples that demanded silence. Slowly, reluctantly, the assembly quieted. The Fleet Admiral Crichtel and the entire Outer Rim Defense Force has been eliminated. His words fell into the silence like stones into still water. 43 vessels. Over 15,000 souls. Gone. The silence stretched, heavy with implications that none of them wanted to face. How? The question came from High Patriarch Zenithul of the Draknari Empire, his serpentine form coiled in defensive postures that spoke of barely contained aggression. Our intelligence indicated 17 human vessels, primitive designs. No match for a Concordat battle fleet. Our intelligence, said a new voice, soft and melodious but carrying undertones that made several delegates flinch, was wrong. All eyes turned to the speaker. Arcanon Yithkar of the Void touched, a species so ancient that they claimed to remember the birth of stars. Their representative was barely corporeal, a shifting mass of dark energy contained within a humanoid outline. When they spoke, reality itself seemed to listen. 300 years ago, we faced a choice, Yithkar continued, their voice like whispers in the cosmic deep. Humanity had become unpredictable. Their expansion was aggressive. Their technology advanced too quickly. Their response to any perceived threat was— They paused, searching for words. Disproportionate. Chancellor Quindar's skin pulsed with impatience. We know the history, Arcanon. The question is what we do now. Do you? Yithkar's form solidified slightly, becoming more present, more real. Do you truly know the history? Or do you know only the sanitized version we told ourselves to justify what we did? The chamber fell into uneasy silence. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. Humanity wasn't exiled for being violent, Yithkar said quietly. Every species has violence in its nature. The Draknari conquered half the outer spiral. The Vortex strip-mined entire systems. Yithkari have eliminated 17 species that they deemed incompatible with their expansion. Uncomfortable rustling swept through the chamber. Humanity was exiled because they were effective at violence. Because when threatened, they didn't retreat or negotiate or seek diplomatic solutions. They escalated. Always. Without exception. Until the threat was eliminated or they— Yithkar's form began to pace, leaving ripples in space-time that the chamber's sensors couldn't quite track. During the Kethloran crisis, when the Kethloran hegemony demanded tribute from human colonies, do you remember humanity's response? They didn't protest to the Council. They didn't seek mediation. They didn't attempt economic sanction. They built a fleet of ships designed for one purpose: the complete annihilation of the Kethloran homeworld. And when we tried to stop them, they turned those same ships on our peacekeeping forces. The silence that followed was absolute. They would have done it, Yithkar whispered. If we hadn't exiled them, they would have cracked the Kethloran homeworld like an egg and watched 8 billion souls die without a flicker of remorse. All because the hegemony demanded taxes from frontier colonies. Chancellor Quindar's skin had gone pale, cycling through colors that indicated deep distress. But surely 3 centuries of exile has moderated them. Yithkar's laughter was like the sound of universes dying, moderated them. Chancellor, what do you think 300 years of exile has done to a species that was already considered too dangerous for civilized space? What do you think happens when you take a predator species, strip them of everything they hold dear, and cast them into the void to die? The answer hung in the air, unspoken but understood by every being in the chamber. You make them hungry. 3 days later, the first reports began to arrive. The Outer Rim colonies were going dark. Not destroyed. The sensor networks would have detected the energy signatures of orbital bombardment or antimatter explosions. Simply dark. Communication arrays fell silent. Trade vessels stopped arriving. Entire star systems vanished from the galactic communication network as if they had never existed. The pattern was always the same. A brief transmission reporting unknown ships in system. Then nothing. No distress calls, no pleas for help, no final transmissions of defiance or despair. Just silence. Admiral Rextani of the Draknari Imperial Navy stood in the war room of the battle fortress Scale of Justice, studying the tactical displays with growing unease. As one of the few military commanders in the Concordat with actual combat experience, The Draknari were perpetually at war with someone. He had been placed in command of the core defense fleet. Looking at the reports, he was beginning to understand why none of his colleagues had wanted the job. Status report, he hissed. His serpentine form coiled around the command console in a position that allowed him to see every display simultaneously. 17 more systems have gone dark in the past 6 hours, reported his aide, Commander Yiltes of the Navigator Guild. Her gaseous form shimmered with anxiety patterns that even her species' legendary emotional control couldn't entirely suppress. The pattern is consistent. Human vessels appear at the edge of a system, advance toward inhabited worlds, then all communication ceases. Any survivors? None that we've been able to contact. We've sent fast scouts to 3 of the affected systems. She paused, her form cycling through colors that indicated reluctance to continue. The scouts returned, but the crews were changed. They claimed to have no memory of their mission. When we attempted to debrief them, they became violent. We had to place them in medical isolation. Rextani's eyes, 6 of them, adapted for tracking multiple prey simultaneously, narrowed. Changed how? They exhibited signs of what our medical staff is calling induced loyalty syndrome. Complete psychological restructuring. They now identify as human citizens of something called the Terran Imperium. They claim the Concordat is an illegal occupation force and that humanity has returned to reclaim its rightful territory. Rextani felt something cold coil in his stomach. Psychological warfare wasn't unknown in galactic conflicts, but this level of complete identity restructuring was beyond anything in his experience. How many systems have gone dark total? 47 in the past week. At the current rate of expansion, they'll reach the core worlds within a month. And we still have no idea how they're doing this. None. Our long-range sensors detect the human fleet. 17 vessels, as reported. But when they engage our defenses, something happens that our technology can't explain. Time distortion, dimensional folding, energy patterns that violate several fundamental laws of physics. Rextani studied the tactical display, his mind racing through possibilities. In his 3 centuries of military service, he had faced impossible odds before. The key was finding the enemy's weakness, the flaw in their strategy that could be exploited. But he couldn't find a flaw in something he couldn't understand. What do we know about their demands? He asked. What do they want? That's the problem, sir. They haven't made any demands. No terms for surrender. No list of grievances. No diplomatic overtures of any kind. They simply appear, eliminate resistance, and move on to the next target. Rextani felt his scales ripple with unease. An enemy with clear objectives could be reasoned with, bought off or at least predicted. An enemy that wanted nothing was infinitely more dangerous. Sir, Yiltes continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, there's something else. The psychological profiles of the converted crews, they don't just claim loyalty to humanity. They claim that humanity is coming home, that this isn't an invasion or a conquest. It's reclamation. Reclamation of what? Everything. Deep in the archives beneath the Concordat Council chambers, Archcanon Ythkar floated through corridors that had not seen living beings in centuries. The void touched needed no light to see, no air to breathe, no solid ground to walk upon. They were creatures of pure thought given quasi-physical form, and in this place of memories and forgotten knowledge, they felt more at home than anywhere else in the galaxy. They were seeking something specific, records that had been sealed 3 centuries ago when the Exile Accords were signed and humanity was cast into the void. Records that contained the real reason for humanity's exile. The official version was true, as far as it went. Humanity had been violent, unpredictable, disproportionately aggressive in their responses to threats. But there had been another reason, one that the Council had never made public, one that made their current situation infinitely worse than anyone suspected. Ythkar found the archive chamber they sought, a crystalline matrix containing data storage devices from every member species of the early Concordat. Here, sealed behind quantum locks and temporal barriers, lay the true history of humanity's exile. They began to read, their consciousness interfacing directly with the data streams. Names, dates, incident reports, classified military assessments. all building toward the moment when the Concordat had made its fateful decision. And there, buried in a report filed by a junior intelligence analyst, was the piece of information that Yithkar had hoped they wouldn't find. The truth about what humanity had been doing in the years before their exile. They had been building something. Not just ships or weapons or defensive systems, but something far more ambitious. Something that had terrified the Concordat's greatest minds and led directly to the decision to remove humanity from the galactic community. Yithkar's form solidified as the implications hit them like a physical blow. Humanity hadn't just been developing military technology. They had been working on what their classified reports called Project Prometheus, an attempt to artificially accelerate their own evolution, to transform themselves into something beyond baseline human norms. The exile hadn't stopped them from completing the project. It had given them 3 centuries to perfect it. Yithkar began to move through the archives with new urgency, seeking more data, more details about what humanity had been attempting. What they found made their ancient consciousness recoil in horror. Genetic manipulation on a species-wide scale. Cybernetic integration that bordered on consciousness transfer. Quantum enhancement of neural pathways. Time dilation fields that allowed accelerated development and training. And at the center of it all, a goal that no other species in the galaxy had ever dared to attempt. The creation of a true hive mind. Not the mechanical linking of individual consciousnesses that some species achieved through technology, but something far more profound, a collective intelligence that retained individual creativity while sharing knowledge, experience, and purpose on a fundamental level. 300 years ago, humanity had been working toward becoming something that could only be described as a singular, unified species entity. The exile had been intended to stop that transformation. Instead, it had provided the perfect laboratory for its completion. Yithkar's consciousness recoiled from the files as the full scope of the threat became clear. The humans returning to Concordat space weren't just an enhanced version of the species that had been exiled. They were something entirely new, something that thought with one mind while acting with 17 or 17,000 or 17 million bodies. They were no longer entirely human. And that meant everything the Concordat thought it knew about fighting them was wrong. Captain Morrison stood in the observation deck of the Inevitable, watching the latest addition to their reclaimed territory drift past the viewport. The colony world of Harvest End had been home to 3 million Althan farmers, their bioluminescent cities creating patterns of light visible even from orbit. Now those patterns had changed. The organic architecture remained, but it pulsed with new rhythms. Human rhythms. The collective consciousness that linked every member of the Terran Imperium had extended its reach to encompass another world, another population, another piece of what had once been stolen from them. Integration proceeding smoothly, reported his tactical officer, Commander Park. But Morrison no longer needed verbal reports. Through the neural link that connected every human in the fleet, every human in their expanding territory, he could feel the success of their latest operation as directly as if he had experienced it himself. 3 million new minds joined to their collective purpose. 3 million souls who now understood the truth that the Concordat had tried to hide. Humanity wasn't the aggressor in this conflict. They were the victims, finally returning home. "Sir," came a voice from the communications station. "We're receiving a transmission from the core worlds. It's Chancellor Quindar himself." Morrison allowed himself a small smile. The Chancellor had finally decided to open diplomatic channels. Perhaps the Concordat was beginning to understand the futility of resistance. On screen, the hologram that materialized showed the leader of the Galactic Concordat in his private chambers rather than the formal council chamber. Morrison took that as a sign of weakness or perhaps fear. "Captain Morrison?" the Chancellor began, his translated voice carrying diplomatic protocols that sounded strained. "I am Chancellor Quindar of the Galactic Concordat. I believe it is time we spoke directly." "I'm listening," Morrison replied, though through the neural link he was simultaneously coordinating the integration of 17 new star systems and planning the next phase of their expansion. "Your people have reclaimed 47 systems in the past 2 weeks. You've converted over 50 million beings to your cause. Surely you must have objectives beyond simple conquest." Morrison's smile widened. The Chancellor still didn't understand what was happening. Chancellor, you're operating under a false assumption. This isn't conquest. Conquest implies taking something that belongs to someone else. These worlds, these systems, these people, they were always ours. The Concord had stole them from us 3 centuries ago. We're simply taking them back. The exile was voted on by every member species. The exile was illegal. Morrison cut him off, his voice carrying harmonics that the universal translator couldn't quite capture. Humanity was a founding member of the Galactic Concordat. We had equal rights to every system, every world, every resource. You took that from us because you feared what we might become. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into the holographic representation of the alien leader. Your fear was justified, but it was also too late. Chancellor Quindar's skin cycled through colors that indicated deep distress. What do you want? Reparations? Territory? A seat on the council? Surely we can reach some accommodation. What we want, Morrison said quietly, is simple. We want everything that was taken from us. Every world that should have been ours. Every resource that was denied us. Every soul that was taught to see us as monsters. The Chancellor's form seemed to shrink. That would mean the complete dissolution of the Concordat. Yes, Morrison agreed. It would. The transmission cut out, leaving Morrison alone with his thoughts, though of course he was never truly alone anymore. Through the neural link, he could feel the satisfaction of 17,000 human souls as they witnessed the Chancellor's growing desperation. Soon the Concordat would fall. Their member species would join the collective consciousness of the Terran Imperium. Their minds freed from the propaganda that had painted humanity as aggressors for so long. They would understand, as the populations of 47 systems already understood, that humanity's return wasn't conquest. It was liberation. And there was nothing the Concordat could do to stop it. The neural link pulsed with shared knowledge as Morrison's awareness expanded to encompass every human consciousness in their growing empire. Through millions of linked minds, he felt the success of their campaign, the joy of reunion with worlds that should have been theirs, the satisfaction of watching their enemies finally understand the futility of resistance. But beneath it all, deeper than conscious thought, Morrison felt something else. Something that had driven their species through 3 centuries of exile and now powered their inexorable advance toward the core worlds. Hunger. Not for food or resources or territory, but for something more fundamental. The hunger of a species that had been cast out to die and had instead transformed itself into something beyond the galaxy's worst nightmares. The hunger for revenge was never satisfied by half measures. And humanity had always been very, very hungry. The inevitable turned toward the next system on their list, its hull scarred by 3 centuries of wandering in the dark between stars. Behind it, 47 conquered systems pulsed with the new rhythms of the Terran Imperium. Ahead lay the core worlds, where the species that had exiled them waited in growing terror. Morrison smiled again, feeling the shared satisfaction of 17,000 linked minds. The Concordat had been right to fear what humanity might become. They simply hadn't been imaginative enough in their fears. Soon they would understand exactly what 3 centuries of exile had created. And by then it would be far too late to do anything about it. In the deepest vaults of the Concordat archive, where even the void-touched rarely ventured, Arch-Canon Yuthkar discovered the final piece of the puzzle, buried beneath layers of quantum encryption and temporal locks, hidden behind security protocols that had been designed to keep secrets until the heat death of the universe, lay humanity's true legacy. Project Prometheus hadn't been abandoned when humanity was exiled. It had been completed. The files that materialized before Yuthkar's consciousness told a story that would have horrified the Concordat Council 3 centuries ago, had they been able to comprehend its implications. Humanity hadn't just been working on genetic enhancement or cybernetic integration. They had been attempting something that violated the fundamental assumptions of sapient existence itself. They had been working to transcend the limitations of individual consciousness. The neural linking technology that the humans now displayed wasn't just advanced cybernetics, it was the final achievement of 3 centuries of directed evolution, guided by minds that could share thoughts across interstellar distances and coordinate actions with the precision of a single organism. Humanity hadn't just been transformed by their exile, they had been unified. Yitkar's ancient consciousness recoiled from the implications. Every human in their fleet, Every human in their conquered territories was simultaneously an individual being and a fragment of something larger. They could think independently, act creatively, even disagree with one another. But beneath that surface, diversity lay a deeper unity of purpose that made them more dangerous than any weapon the galaxy had ever seen. They weren't just coordinated, they were orchestrated, and their conductor was something that defied classification in any known taxonomy of sapient life. Yithkar began to move through the archives with desperate urgency, seeking any information that might suggest a way to combat this new form of consciousness. What they found only deepened their despair. The humans' collective intelligence wasn't just shared knowledge or coordinated action. It was recursive, self-improving, capable of learning and adapting at a rate that individual minds could never match. Every strategic defeat taught them new lessons. Every tactical success was immediately shared across their entire civilization. They were becoming smarter with each engagement, and they had been doing so for 300 years. Yithkar's form solidified as they reached a terrible conclusion. The Concordat wasn't just losing a war, they were losing to an enemy that was literally evolving faster than they could adapt to fight it. An enemy that had already won. The assault on Corfac Prime began at exactly 0300 Galactic Standard Time. Admiral Rex Stani watched from the command deck of the Scale of Justice as 17 human ships materialized at the edge of the core world's massive defense grid. Around them, the greatest concentration of military force in Concordat history, waited in perfect formation, 3,000 vessels representing every member species, armed with weapons that could crack planets and defended by shields that could withstand stellar collapse. It should have been enough. By any rational calculation, it was impossible for 17 ships, regardless of their technology, to overcome such overwhelming numerical superiority. But Rexenti had studied the reports from the Outer Rim. He knew that rational calculations no longer applied when fighting humanity. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "the human fleet is broadcasting on all frequencies. Put it through." The voice that filled the command deck was different from the Captain Morrison, who had spoken to Admiral Crickstill weeks earlier. It carried the same words, the same cadence, but underneath lay something new, something that made Rex Depuni's scales ripple with instinctive terror. It was the voice of 17,000 humans speaking in perfect unison. "People of the Galactic Concordat," the collective voice began, "you have gathered here to defend a lie. You have been told that humanity is your enemy, that we seek conquest and domination. You have been told that the exile was necessary to preserve galactic peace." On the tactical display, Rexeni watched as the 17 human ships began to move in patterns that defied both physics and logic. They seemed to fold space around themselves, appearing and disappearing like ghosts made of metal and malice. "We are here to offer you the truth." What happened next would be debated by Zanab psychologists and military historians for generations, assuming any survived to debate it. The human ships didn't attack the Concordat fleet. They didn't fire weapons or launch torpedoes or engage in any recognizable form of combat. Instead, they began to broadcast. Not words or images or sounds, but something far more fundamental, raw information, transmitted on frequencies that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the deepest levels of sapient consciousness. Every being in the Concordat fleet suddenly found their minds flooded with images, memories, experiences that weren't their own. They saw the galaxy as humanity had seen it 3 centuries ago, a young species eager to contribute to a peaceful interstellar community, sharing their technology and knowledge freely with their new allies. They felt the growing fear of other species. As humanity's rapid development began to outpace the established order, they experienced the secret meetings, the whispered conversations, the gradual realization that humanity was being systematically excluded from decisions about their own future. And they witnessed the moment when the Concordat made its choice: exile or extermination. "Sir," Rex Dene's tactical officer screamed, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. "The fleet. Something's happening to the fleet." Rex Dene forced his attention back to the tactical display, though part of his mind was still processing the flood of human memories. What he saw there made no sense. Across the entire Concordat battle line, ships were powering down their weapons. Not because they had been damaged or disabled, but because their crews were choosing to stand down. "Contact the flagship," he ordered. "What are they doing?" "Sir, I'm receiving reports from across the fleet. The crews, they're saying they won't fire on the humans. They're saying the humans are right." Rex the Knave felt something cold and terrible coil in his stomach. "What do you mean, they're right?" "They're saying the exile was illegal. That humanity was wrongfully expelled from the Concordat. That we're the aggressors in this conflict." On the display, more ships continued to power down their weapons. Entire battle groups were dropping their shields and opening communication channels to the human fleet. The greatest military force in galactic history was surrendering without firing a single shot. "How?" Rex Ixtani whispered. "How are they doing this?" The answer came not from his tactical officer, but from the collective voice of humanity itself, speaking directly into his mind through channels he hadn't known existed. "We learned," the voice said, and Rextani realized that every being in the fleet was hearing the same words. 3 centuries of exile taught us many things. How to survive in the void between stars. How to make something from nothing. How to turn pain into purpose. The human ships had stopped moving, hanging motionless in space like dark angels pronouncing judgment. But most importantly, we learned how to share truth. Not the sanitized version that your governments feed you, but raw, unfiltered reality. The reality of what happened to us. What you did to us. What you made us become. Rextani felt his own certainty beginning to crumble as more memories flooded his consciousness. Human children dying in failing life support systems as their parents searched desperately for habitable worlds. Human abandoned to die when Concordat member species refused to trade with the exiles. Human explorers finding dead systems that should have been teeming with life, realizing that their own kind had been systematically denied the right to exist. "We're not invaders," the voice continued, and Rextani found himself believing it despite everything he had been taught. "We're refugees, coming home to reclaim what was always ours." Around him, his bridge crew was openly weeping. Even the normally stoic Draknari were showing signs of emotional breakdown as the full weight of humanity's suffering crashed into their consciousness. "Sir," his communications officer whispered, "the Chancellor is broadcasting on all emergency frequencies. He's ordering a general retreat." Rextani looked at the tactical display one last time. Of the 3,000 ships that had come to defend Corfac Prime, fewer than 100 still had their weapons powered. The rest had joined the growing procession of vessels moving toward the human fleet, their crews eager to make amends for 3 centuries of injustice. The Concordat hadn't just lost the battle. They had lost the war. And they had lost it without the humans firing a single shot. Chancellor Quindar stood alone in his private chambers, watching through the vast transpersteel windows as the greatest fleet in Concordat history surrendered to 17 human ships. His luminescent skin had gone pale, cycling through colors that indicated a level of distress that his species had no words for. Behind him, the emergency session of the Concordat Council continued in chaos. 53 species arguing, pleading, demanding answers that he couldn't provide. Some called for immediate surrender. Others wanted to fight to the last ship. A few suggested fleeing to distant galaxies where humanity might never find them. But Quindar knew it was already too late for any of those options. Humanity hadn't just returned with superior technology or overwhelming force. They had returned with something far more dangerous, the ability to make their enemies see the truth. And the truth was that the Concordat had been built on a lie. A soft chime indicated an incoming transmission. Quindar accepted it without looking, knowing who it would be. Captain Morrison's image materialized in the center of the room, but he was no longer alone. Flanking him were representatives of every species that had joined the human cause. Alphan farmers whose bioluminescent skin now pulsed in harmony with human neural rhythms. Vorthic soldiers whose chitinous exoskeletons bore new patterns that spoke of shared purpose. Even void-touched entities whose ancient consciousness had been integrated into humanity's collective awareness. "Chancellor," Morrison said, and his voice carried undertones that spoke for 17,000 human souls and 50 million converted citizens of what had once been Concordat space. "It's time." "Time for what?" Quindar asked, though he already knew the answer. "Time for you to come home." The words hung in the air like a judgment. Behind Quindar, The emergency council session fell silent as the transmission was automatically broadcast to every delegate. "The Concordat is finished," Morrison continued. "Your member species are joining us freely, once they understand the truth of what happened 3 centuries ago. Your military has laid down their arms rather than fight for a cause they know is unjust. Your government has lost all legitimacy." Quandar's skin cycled through patterns of desperation. What about mercy? What about forgiveness? Surely, after all this time, mercy. Morrison's smile was like the edge of a blade. "Chancellor, we are being merciful. We could have returned with weapons designed to crack planets. We could have turned your own citizens against you through force. We could have made this a war of extermination." He leaned forward, his eyes reflecting something that Quindar's species had no name for but recognized instinctively. "Instead, we're offering you the chance to join us willingly, to become part of something greater than the sum of its parts, to help us build the galaxy that should have existed 3 centuries ago. And if we refuse..." Morrison's expression didn't change, but somehow the weight of his presence seemed to increase. "You won't refuse. Not once you understand what we're really offering." The transmission ended, leaving Quindar alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that resistance was not just futile, it was wrong. Through the windows, he could see the human fleet approaching Korthak Prime, 17 ships that had somehow conquered the greatest civilization in galactic history without firing a shot. Behind them came the converted Concordat vessels, their crews eager to welcome their former enemies home. Quindar closed his eyes and made his choice. When he opened them again, his skin was beginning to pulse with new patterns. Patterns that spoke of unity, of shared purpose, of a future where the artificial divisions between species would finally be erased. He walked to his communications console and opened a channel to every world, every ship, every soul in what had once been Concordat space. "Citizens of the former galactic Concordat," he began, his voice carrying new harmonics that the universal translators somehow understood perfectly. "Today marks the end of one age and the beginning of another. Today we come home." 3 months later, the transformation was complete. What had once been Concordat space was now the Terran Imperium, a unified civilization spanning 12,000 star systems and encompassing 47 species. The integration had proceeded more smoothly than anyone had dared hope, as populations that had once lived in fear of human aggression discovered the reality of human purpose. They hadn't been conquered. They had been liberated. Captain Morrison, now Admiral Morrison of the Imperial Fleet, stood in the observation deck of his flagship as it orbited Earth for the first time in 300 years. The planet below looked exactly as he had expected it to, blue and green and white, a jewel floating in the cosmic dark. Through the neural link that now connected every citizen of the Imperium, he could feel the emotions of his people as they looked upon the world that had given birth to their species. Joy, wonder, sadness for all the generations who had died without seeing this sight, and underneath it all, satisfaction. The hunger that had driven them through 3 centuries of exile was finally satisfied. They had returned. They had reclaimed what was theirs. They had united the galaxy under a single purpose. But as Morrison watched Earth turn slowly beneath his ship, he found himself thinking about the future, about what came next for a civilization that had achieved everything it had set out to accomplish. The galaxy was vast, but it was no longer infinite. They had claimed every habitable world, integrated every sapient species, unified every disparate culture under the banner of the Terran Imperium. But beyond this galaxy lay others. Millions of them, each containing billions of stars and countless worlds that had never known the touch of human ambition. Through the neural link, Morrison felt the stirring of a new purpose, a new hunger. The exile was over. The reclamation was complete. Now it was time for expansion. He smiled, feeling the shared anticipation of 60 billion linked minds as they contemplated the infinite possibilities that lay beyond the galactic rim. Humanity had spent 3 centuries learning to survive in the void between stars. Perhaps it was time to teach the rest of the universe what they had learned. The inevitable turned away from Earth, its sensors already reaching toward the distant galaxies that glittered like diamonds in the cosmic deep. Behind it, 12,000 star systems pulsed with the unified heartbeat of the Terran Imperium. Ahead lay infinity, and humanity transformed, unified, unstoppable, was finally ready to claim it. The age of exile was over. The age of empire had begun. In the vast expanse of intergalactic space, where even light struggled to bridge the gulf between galaxies, something vast and patient stirred. Ancient beyond measure, older than stars themselves, the Watchers had observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. They had seen species evolve from primitive tool users to galactic empires, watched as they burned bright and then faded into cosmic dust. But they had never seen anything quite like humanity. The transformation of the Milky Way had taken mere months, a blink of an eye in cosmic terms. The integration of 47 species into a single unified consciousness was unprecedented in the Watchers' billion-year vigil. Even more unprecedented was the speed with which this new civilization was now turning its attention outward, toward the other galaxies that hung like islands in the cosmic ocean. The Watchers convened in council, their ancient minds touching across distances that would have staggered lesser beings. For the first time in eons, they faced a decision that would shape the fate of the universe itself. Humanity had broken the ancient pattern. They had achieved what no species before them had ever accomplished: true unity without the loss of individual identity. They had created something new under the stars. The question was, would they share this gift with the universe, or would they impose it? The answer would determine whether the next age would be one of unprecedented peace and cooperation, or the final conquest of everything that existed. In the deep void between galaxies, the Watchers waited and prepared. The greatest test in the history of consciousness itself was about to begin.